And we are recording. So now to introduce our speaker, Gabriel Leite Mota is a professor of economics at the Instituto Superior de Serviço Social do Porto. He is a pioneer in the study of the economics of happiness in Portugal, having been active in the field since 2005, and awarded a PhD on the topic in 2010 by the Faculty of Economics at the University of Porto. He has vast teaching and research experience and was the creator of the discipline of economics of happiness at the BSc in economics at the University of Madeira, which was the first of its kind in Portugal while he was teaching there. He has a regular media presence and is often invited to speak at conferences about the economics of happiness in his home country. For me, it is a real pleasure to host Gabriel, as the topic of his presentation comes very close to my own work and research interest over the past few years. It is also a great occasion to catch up with him, as it has been really a long time since we last met. However, without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Professor Gabriel Leite Mota. Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be here speaking, having this opportunity to speak about these topics, and I hope you all enjoy this presentation I will give. Yeah, as you have mentioned, my background is on the economics of happiness, and I'm trying here to portray the relationships that we can established between the economics of happiness results and how those results can facilitate a green transition, which is a very hot topic of the present. So I will just now share my presentation with you all. Let me just check here. Okay, can you see it? Is it okay? Okay, so let's begin. So the title of my presentation is Using the Happiness Framework as a Catalyst for the Green Transition. As Francesco have told, I'm professor of economics at the Instituto Superior de Serviço Social of Porto. So what I'm trying to do here is summarized in these three topics. So my idea is to first consider how we got here. So we live in a world with certain conditions, with a defined economic system in a globalized world, and sometimes we forget that a path was taken to reach here. And what I'm trying to do here is try to synthesize what were the main reasons why we got to the actual state where we now live in. Then I move on and announce some of the dilemmas of the green transition. So we are facing this climate crisis. Climate scientists tells us that we need to change, we need to stop our greenhouse emissions, but how can we do that in a practical manner and as quickly as possible, considering that we live in the model that we live and it's very hard to change it? And finally, my idea is just to say that some of the main results from the happiness literature can help us doing that transition and hopefully making this transition easier to implement and easier to get public support. I just start my presentation with a couple of images that I consider relevant to illustrate the thing that I was saying before. So how we got here and what is the present. And when we look at these pictures, they are all very similar and they represent an exponential change. So human beings lived in this planet for a long time, almost in the same conditions, almost with the same numbers. And then suddenly we got an explosion. we got more production measured by the GDP, we got more population, and we were living longer lives. So they all follow the same path, and they are obviously interrelated. At the same time, there is the flip of the other side of the coin of this situation, which is we need more energy. We are consuming much more energy than before. As a consequence, we are also emitting greenhouse gas with an exponential path as well. And those who try to calculate the sustainability of this path tell us that we have already crossed the ecological sustainability, so we are overshooting our possibilities to sustain this path. So something has to be done. But this picture are all very similar, so they represent in a way the same situation. So first of all, how we got here, and I've called this topic the religion of GDP, because I wanted to frame this way because, as I've said before, we sometimes live in the present and forget that the present could be very different from what it is. And in practice, although many religions exist in the world and some are more dominant than others, I would say that the religion of GDP is the most important of all. And because it crosses all countries, all people in the world. And why is that the case? Why have we moved into this direction? And I point three main forces that I think are crucial: economic forces, political forces, and intellectual forces. And economic forces, this notion that when economic growth starts, there is some mechanisms that enable or reinforce that movement. Of course, we can talk about endogenous growth models, but apart from that, there are mechanisms that favor the continuity of economic growth, and we will discuss them briefly. Then, politically, and thinking mostly from democracies, there are some forces that channel our societies towards economic growth. Let it be the politicians, let it be the voters, let it be lobbyists. They all have tended to prioritize economic progress as the main political choice. And finally, and also very important, the intellectual forces. And here I call economics, namely neoclassical economics, and management theories that all are built in this idea of markets, profits, and growth. So they all combine themselves to generate intellectual reasons and intellectual tools to move also in the direction of economic growth. Of course, Enlightenment and liberalism have paved this route before. So talking about economic forces, what can we pinpoint? We can say that the economies of scale are present. So this is a very, very basic notion from economics that once a firm starts to grow, there is this tendency to reduce its unitary costs, its average costs, and that favors the growth of firms, and the other firms tries to copy that, and then we enter a cycle of growth. And there are some empirical evidence for recent countries like South Korea here. Next, we have learning by doing and specialization. This is the main idea from Smith, but again, other economists have reinforced that, and empirics also reinforce this. Once we specialize our workforce, we get more productivity, we get more profit, and then we can grow. We grow economically. So this also contributes to this path. Then we have capitalism. And in capitalism, there is this game, this fight for profit, and only those who seek efficiency and productivity can survive. The others go bankrupt. So again, this is a mechanism that favors, and this is one of the strongest defense of the capitalists' model, is that it embodies innovation and produces economic growth. And the world is moving towards a global capitalism. And also interdependence, which we now all are subjects of, with the pandemic and with the disruption of the distribution channels, and now with the inflation. Are all realities that tell us that we live in an interdependent world, but we have no choice, because if we opt out, then we are doomed to some poverty. So again, the interdependence favors economic growth, and economic growth favors interdependence. So again, the circle, the virtuous circle in this sense. And finally, but very important, goods and services, although we will discuss further something about this, but goods and services basically produce well-being. Otherwise, we wouldn't be living in the world we live. If goods and services were actually bad things, long time ago we would have abandoned them. So goods and services provide goods and services. They do good things, and that's why we sustain them. Looking now to political forces, the politicians, the voters, there is this interrelation between the two, where voters tend to award those politicians when the economy goes well, and tend to penalize them when the economy goes bad. This is very strong in the empirical literature, and this transforms the way politicians behave, always considering the consequences of those actions, of their actions, of their policies on economic growth. And one of the reasons this is so hard to change is that if we need, for instance, stoppage time in the economic growth to make a transition, that will be very hard to sell to voters and to public opinion, because this model is in motion. And also lobbyists, of course, they care about their sector more specifically, but they tend to live better in a world that grows rather than in a world that is in recession. So they also contribute to this notion of economic growth. And finally, I choose to put this dimension into political forces, because the creation of GDP by Simon Kuznets was very important to the consolidation of GDP as the main thing that society should look at. And although we know, and I will show you the sentence, that he didn't think that way, but in practice that was what happened. We created an index of production. All countries in the world started to use it, and all countries in the world started to compare themselves regarding the level of their production. Going now to the intellectual forces. So we have neoclassical economics. That is only one way of conceive the economic discipline. But in the neoclassical economics, the central idea is the market efficiency, competition, market efficiency, and then we have a social optimum. That's what the fundamental theorems of welfare economics tells us. So in neoclassical economics, we have this body of research and theoretical models that are always saying the same thing. And if we look at the literature on economic growth, is one of the largest in economics, because economic growth gained centrality, because neoclassical economics is in a way justifying economic growth and capitalism, by the way. And also management. It's not by accident that in many faculties there is this, they are neighbors or living in the same department, business and economics. Management was created by businessmen that wanted to foster their capabilities. And in management, we are always trying to understand how to maximize profits, or how to maximize efficiency, or how to increase productivity of our firms. And if we do that in practice, in the micro world, then we will contribute to the economic growth. And also liberalism. Liberalism is the dominant philosophy of the Western society, and plays and puts the individual in the center of everything. And the individual as an entity that with subjective preferences, with subjective tastes, that should be served through markets. So all these pieces make sense together and all contribute to a world that moves in the direction of economic growth, without questioning many times if this is the sole solution or the sole alternative. In practice, again, we live in a world that to become rich is what I call the mainstream utopia, and a practical religion, as I've mentioned before. So nowadays, everyone wants to be rich rather than virtuous or other things that we could think of, and this is mainstream. Nobody questions that, or at least many people don't question. And so I finished this point with the now famous quotation from Simon Kuznets in 1934, when launching the GDP, and he said this: the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of the national income. So the creator of the thing was saying that the thing was not designed to measure welfare, and nevertheless, we nowadays live in a world that continues to believe that GDP is crucial to welfare. Irony of lives. Point two, moving to the dilemmas of the green transition. So the point here is that we want, or we need to perform a change in the way we live, in the way we produce, in the way we consume, but at the same time, we are in the middle of a model, of a system that is global, that penetrates all spheres of life. And so thinking about making a rupture or a drastic change, it's definitely not an easy task. And what can be the two, I would call, extreme solutions? One solution would be to be cut drastically on polluting production and consumption. So we need to cut on fossil fuels, you need to cut on cement, we need to cut on concrete, we need to cut on lots of things, on food, lots of massive agriculture or industrial agriculture. So lots of things that we depend on that we would need to cut, or at least to make a drastic reduction. And that is very, very, very hard to achieve without causing frustration, massive poverty, hunger, perma to death. How can we convince people Of course, we now have theorists like McCaskill that they are saying that the future is more important than the present, which is contrary to economics thoughts that rate of interest is present is more important than the future, but they are claiming other way around. But that would be, of course, a justification for massive loss in the present, for more gains in the future. But I guess most people wouldn't agree with this. Then we have another solution that some believe can be possible, which is operate a major technological breakthrough. So believing in the possibilities of technology that in the past, for instance, have allowed us to escape the Malthus prediction that we live always on poverty, and we were able to escape and expand the number of people in the earth, and we're able to expand the per capita food intake, all thanks to technology improvements. Can technology save us from climate change? Can technology produce all that we need to live a good life and at the same time save the environment? Some believe we can do that. Some believe we can't, or we don't have the time to do that, to wait for that. Of course, in practice, we are doing a combination of the two. So we are betting in new technologies, and at the same time, we're trying to reduce in some more polluting production and consumption. What would be the cutting solution? The cutting solution would be hard to implement because we have a model that is installed that has the powers of the institutional power for it. And so how can we go against those interests? We even have those who deny that we live in a climate change or in a climate emergency. And again, we all depend on economic growth to our comfort. And how many of us are willing to stop those comforts or diminish those comforts? So this cutting solution is constantly being marked as a drastic or radical position. Actually, we have the degrow movement that is trying to build theories and trying to reach a possible solution for this. But they are very criticized by mainstream economists, and they have this issue with sufficiency, because it's in practice very hard to define what's sufficiency for the people's needs. And then we have this, what I've called poverty trap, not in traditional economic terms of vicious circles of poverty, but the argument that if we cut on economic growth, we are dooming people to stay in poverty, namely those in the poor countries, and we are not allowing them to pursue the path that we have already passed in the past. So we were able to pollute in the past, and now we are saying that you cannot grow because you cannot pollute. That wouldn't be fair. So this is also a strong argument in a sense. The more optimal perspective is the technology solution. And the technology solution has many domains, many working fields. One is circular economy, where we try to create circles of production, consumption, waste, and production and consumption, waste, and so on, trying not to generate waste products, trying to take advantage of all things. And so trying to make production and consumption much more effective and efficient. saving the planet, so saving the environment. Of course, some efforts are being made in this direction, but the impact is not dramatic. Then we are also betting on alternative energy sources like renewable sources, and huge steps have been made in this direction. The solar panels are now much more efficient and much cheaper. But again, we lack scale of production, and we have the problem of intermittency. So maybe the batteries will solve a little bit of those problems, but it's not enough yet. Then we have the sharing economy. So new ways to consume and produce that take advantage of things that are not in use all the time and try to share those things with more people. Cars would be a perfect example. And but again, blockchain also is a technology that could help us in the sharing economy or producing more efficient and eco-friendly consumption. But again, the reality of sharing economy is not impacting so much the environment. And then we still have this dependency on a radical innovation. So in reality, we need a technological breakthrough that would make it possible to dispense oil and gas. And that would only be possible maybe with the nuclear fusion that I have this picture from a nuclear reactor, an experimental nuclear reactor, where they are trying to reach that kind of breakthrough, but it isn't here yet. Sorry, my dog is barking. In practice, again, what we are doing is the mixed solution. So we are institutionally using things like the IPCC meetings to align interests, to reach to global action, but this is a very, very difficult problem of global action. The Sustainable Development Goals as well, but again, they lack coercive enforcement and they face conflicting interests, so it's not easy. Then we have environmental economics that is trying to accommodate the notion of profit, the notion of markets, the notion of self-interest with the environmental restraints. And that's where emissions trading systems came from, and some are in practice and some are doing well in the task of reducing carbon emissions. But then again, we face what I call bilateral prejudice, because in this area it's easy to find people very entrenched on their viewpoints. So it's easy to find an economist that discredits completely degrowth theories or some form of not betting on growth. And on the other side, we will find climate scientists or environmentalists that completely disregard technology as a possible solution, or they completely discredit this possible technological breakthrough. So it's a world hard to reconcile and to reach a compromise. And then we have the distributional issue of the climate transition, what has been called environmental justice. And so here, what we are saying is, again, how to distribute the costs and benefits of the green transition, of a climate change saving mechanism that does not put all the costs in the poor and give all the benefits to the rich, which, by the way, the economic growth sometimes do that, but so that's not only a problem of climate for this green transition, but we have to face it. And then I use this image from the movie Don't Look Up. Here is the United States president character in the movie, where people are told not to look up to the rock that will hit and destroy the planet, and to look to the ground, to be very focused on the present. Of course, this is a metaphor for the climate change problem, but I bring this because it's, for me, this movie, in a very funny way, describes important things, namely the issue that it's very hard to convince public opinion on topics that are not easily captured in the short run. And then we reach to the contributions of the happiness literature. So when studying the happiness literature, we nowadays have tons of papers, but there are some key points that we can identify that would help us in doing this, in smoothing this transition. And I choose here three main issues. The first, the non-linearity between happiness and GDP. So this is one of the key insights from the economics of happiness. Obviously, Histolin in 74 already mentioned this. The relationship between GDP and happiness is not linear. So we have room to change GDP with few impact on happiness. It's not always the case that the same amount of reduction on GDP, for instance, would cause the same amount of reduction on happiness. So we have room to move there. Then the importance of non-material dimensions of life. So all the stuff that is not accounted for in GDP, but that has a positive effect on life, those things can be enhanced, and at the same time GDP stays still and environment stay protected. And finally, the direct relation between environment and happiness. Now, some more recent studies are being able to identify that the environment causes direct impact on our well-being. And so, detailing a little bit more, GDP isn't a stairway to happiness, so it's not linear relationship. We have here the graph. I know you guys are there in the Luxembourg, or at least STATEC is, and Luxembourg is one of the happiest countries in the world, is actually one of the richest countries in the world. But then again, when we look at this image, we can identify that Finland is happier than Luxembourg, with much lesser GDP per capita. And I marked there Portugal to compare with South Korea and Hong Kong. Both have higher GDPs, but are less happier than Portugal is. So if we look only at the right-hand side of this picture, starting from the $20,000, the relation is not clear, whereas for the poor, as we know, is much stronger. So there is room to move and to not necessarily have to bet on economic growth in order to enhance happiness. In other way, there is room for us to produce well-being while not enhancing GDP, while not endangering the environment. There is this paper that tries to compare GDP with the Genuine Progress Index, and they observe that GDP continues to grow, but GPI flattens. And again, if we are jeopardizing the livability, the planet's livability, and our happiness is not increasing, why are we still doing that? So that's food for thought. Then we can also say that less GDP can be good, which is very strange, very hard for our mindset. But in fact, the happiness literature have already shown that some realities incorporated in economic growth destroy happiness, like commuting, long working hours, or conspicuous consumption. All this contributes to economic growth, but destroy happiness, or at least do not produce as we would thought. Not generating such things would save the planet and increase happiness, or at least would not decrease happiness. So this is also important. And also the classical utilitarian conclusion, the economics of happiness is very aligned with this notion that redistribution of income favors the enhancement of average happiness. So giving more to the poor at the expense of the rich would even out, would increase the average happiness, and at the same time would save us from that need of those poor countries to move in the direction of that we have made in the past, even if we have to give them money directly. The second point is immateriality matters, and this is very, very strong on happiness literature. So relations, trust, job, quality, purpose of life, all these things matter. All these things are not absolutely dependent on GDP growth. On the contrary, some of these things sometimes might be corrode with GDP growth. For instance, interpersonal relations. For if we work too long, if our work environment is too competitive, the quality of our interpersonal relations might diminish. Loneliness is a problem for all Western society, so it's a lack of quantity of interpersonal relationships. So this are all problems. So we can increase this immaterial side of life. We can enhance it, and we don't need GDP for that. Trust is another example. We can increase or cultivate trust on each other, trust on institutions, and that, for instance, when in Portugal they ask if Portugal, what can Portugal do to enhance happiness, I sometimes say that as we are not one of the richest countries in the world, we would still benefit from economic growth, but we could bet on things that do not need economic growth, as trust in institutions, because in Portugal this is one issue. We have low levels of social capitals and trust, and that's one of the things that explains why Portugal typically stays below what would be expected for our level of national income. And job quality as well. Recently, a study in Portugal, Portuguese were amongst the most unhappy workers on the European Union. So we can enhance the quality of our jobs. Some studies eventually show that would increase productivity, but even if it does not increase productivity, it would increase happiness, because the time we spend at our work, it's really important for our life as a whole. And finally, our purpose of life, I've mentioned before, we live in the religion of GDP. Everyone wants to be rich, but to become rich, it has a social problem, because to be rich means to be richer than other. It is impossible for all to be rich at the same time. To be rich means to be richer than others, which means that there will always be the rich and the poor. And if we destroy the planet in the meantime, we have a problem. Whereas, for instance, practicing a virtue as to be kind, it doesn't harm the planet, and it has this contagious effect, that the others tend to be kinder. So it's
Hey, Gabriel, sorry to interrupt you. This is just to tell you that we are approaching the 40 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So
Sorry, I
suggest that perhaps you try to, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, try to get towards the conclusion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't realize it. But finally, the direct relationship between environment and happiness, outdoor pleasures. There are studies that shows us that enjoying the outdoors gives us satisfaction, and on the contrary, the climate change is generating anxiety, already labeled as eco-anxiety, and that's a problem. So preserving the environment has these two positive direct effects on happiness. And so, as Iselin put it, economic growth does not raise a society to some ultimate state of plenty. And so, summing it all up, this is the idea that I'm putting forward. We can use the happiness literature to identify GDP components that are destroying happiness. Such GDP reduction is a good thing, more happiness and less ecological damage. At the same time, we can use the literature, the happiness literature, to identify determinants of happiness that are not accounted for in GDP. More happiness is possible with no economic growth, more happiness with no ecological footprint. And using the happiness literature to evaluate the direct importance of nature, we can sell the idea that preserving nature is a good thing, not a cost or a wasted opportunity to grow. And finally, fighting poverty with more redistribution means higher average happiness and less pressure to pollute more. So these are some references. Thank you very much, and sorry for exceeding my time.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Gabriel. It was extremely interesting. I really enjoyed your presentation. Okay, you are just a couple of minutes longer. I just wanted to make sure that people would have a possibility to
of course.
to comment. Because I think that there is so much into your presentation that I'm confident people may want to contribute. So while waiting for questions, if anyone wants to ask questions, you feel free to raise your virtual hand or to drop a question in the chat, and we will read it aloud.
Maybe I should stop here. Okay.
Yeah, cool. So we can all see each other. So while people are thinking about, I profit of my position, my privileged position, to start cracking the ice. So, for instance, I am completely in agreement with your argument. I do believe that happiness economics, or if you want, the science of subjective well-being, that goes just beyond economics, has some insights that can help us better accept what it takes to transition towards a more sustainable societies. The question is, how would you, where would you start from for this? Which kind of leverages would you use from the happiness economics to start this transition? And if we are in a way so culturally embedded into this idea that more is better, how do we deconstruct it?
Yeah, I don't know if you prefer for me to respond directly or to collect some.
Maybe we can also collect a few questions, okay. 2 or 3 questions at once. I see the next hands is by Sama.
Let me just take notes. Take notes.
Sure.
So where to start?
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I did a very similar presentation today, actually, earlier on. So a lot of parallels and similar conclusions. I guess I just kind of a couple of kind of points to suggest in terms of like additional comments which support your argument, I guess. So you talked about intellectual forces that support GDP, and one of the ones which I think is important, and you kind of alluded to it, but you didn't quite use the word, which is materialism, I guess.
Okay.
So in the sense of sort of actually sort of, as you say, sort of GDP is this kind of religion, this religion that what's best for the country is economic growth, and materialism is this belief that what's good for me is more money. So there's a parallel at the individual level. And then, funnily enough, you said there was no definition for sufficiency, and it's funny you should say that, because just this week there has been an official definition of sufficiency in the
Okay.
sorry, last week even in the latest IPCC report. So in the IPCC report, the synthesis report, they included a definition of sufficiency, and recognized, I think, sort of it's great that the IPCC is recognizing that sufficiency is a necessary and central part of dealing with the climate change crisis. So yeah, I think just wanted to add, and I guess also just, I mean, I know in the end you came to a very positive conclusion, but some of your slides in the beginning where you were kind of like saying, like that, for example, you mentioned that degrowth is very heavily criticized. Of course, it's heavily criticized, but there's going to be an EU conference about degrowth. So I mean, it is starting to enter the debate. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
There are still two questions in the chat. I will pass them along. The first is by Paul Rogers, who just asks whether the slide on happiness economics as a solution is missing the mention of the experience economy.
Experience?
Yeah, perhaps Paul wants to clarify what he means.
Thanks, Francesco. I don't know whether it is possible to reload the slides and just go back to it.
Okay.
It was the one immediately prior to the graph where you compared Hong Kong and South Korea with Portugal, for example.
Okay, here.
Yeah, that one above that, the one above that.
Okay.
This one. So when you talk about happiness sorry, forgive me. First of all, this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Gabriel. Very enlightening and very structured, and so many great points. So when you talk about here, happiness as a framework for the green transition, you mentioned these three bullets underneath, which are very significant to me. But when we're trying to consider what makes people happy, what contributes to happiness, I think there are people's experience of life, or the richness of experience is a very important dimension to consider. And for me, I couldn't see where the kind of experience economy would sit within these three bullets. Perhaps it's not relevant, or perhaps it's already embraced in there somewhere, but just wasn't expressed. But when we think about trying to address the balance between the developed and the less developed world, the tourism industry is a huge opportunity to take the wealth of the north, if you like, to improve life in the south. And this is all, so the experience economy is a particular element that I think is important, but I wasn't sure if it was embraced. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. Yeah. Francesco, if I can just answer these three questions and then we move on.
Sure, sounds good.
So just starting from the end, I guess that experience side of our life is incorporated in the non-material dimensions of life and the direct relation between environment and happiness. So I would say that dimension is entangled on those 2 points that I've made, but of course it's important because several studies have shown us that people tend to enjoy more experiences than goods. So you should travel more and buy less cars. But environmentally, we may have a problem because, for instance, tourism, as you've mentioned, there is a footprint from traveling and building hotels and destroying some landscapes to produce more comfortable stays for the tourists, and even for the enhancement of the poor countries. We know that some poor countries have tourism, but they're still poor because tourism doesn't pay very well to people. So I would say that that's important, that we could find ways to gain something there, but it's not linear the relations to environment. But thank you for the point. Regarding materialism, of course, I didn't mention materialism, but it's in a way involved in all this when we talk about the growth of GDP, the individualism and liberalism. So that's one part of the story. I could mention it directly. And regarding the definition, thank you. I confess I haven't read it, but for me the point remains because it's difficult to get the support for that sufficiency definition. So we could we could draw a definition, but then in practice, because that's one of the things that the capitalist argument is against, and so many people is against, is the fact that only I know what is sufficient for me, and apparently never never is enough. So this is the liberal argument. So that's what I was trying to say, rather than, of course, I can find definitions. Thank you. Where to start? Of course, it's not, Francesco, it's not easy to say where to start, but if I imagine with the capacity to intervene in government, I would say that try to use the happiness equations and the econometrics of happiness, and try to measure for instance, as some trying to do, measure the value of things with the happiness, the impacts of the shadow prices of happiness wise, and then try to illustrate with numbers, because people usually tend to like numbers, that interpersonal relations, they are very, very important. They account for this amount of money. And so we have a reason to invest in this. And at the same time, this is a green attitude. So we can add a surplus to this. So we can try to make an account of this using science of happiness.
Yep. Thanks for your replies, Gabriel. I kind of had a kind of chicken and egg problem in my head. Like the policymaker who adopts this kind of framework might find himself at a loss compared to someone who wishes to. I mean, if he's fighting against the prominent culture of more is better. And so I was wondering if you had ideas on how to tackle this issue, but okay. Going back to questions from the audience, Tiffany asks, looks like you are using happiness as a stand-in for subjective well-being broadly. I wanted to confirm that. And given that, do you understand your argument to remain true for well-being measures like optimism? In the meantime, I don't see any other question. There is a comment. Congratulations from Joe Sirgi for your work in the chat. And if there is anyone else who has questions, please raise your hands. In the meantime, back to
Johannes.
Sorry, I'm missing the hands of Oliver. Oliver, please.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your presentation. And in fact, in your presentation, you put really well the difficulty that we have with the current economy, neoclassic economy, to take into account environmental issue and happiness. And green transition is try to find a solution with the current economy and neoclassical rules. But why don't think to change the framework and go further than the green transition? To give a funny sentence, if you don't like an indicator like GDP, why don't change the indicator? Why to think to change our economy for more happiness and more environmental friendliness? Think about other indicator like richness. where you could define your richness not only with economic flow of monetary trade, but you include the information on stocks, on social information, on knowledge, on natural capital, and this kind of things. Perhaps you have some reflection on that. Thank you.
I would collect also the last question by Johannes.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Gabriel. So I can agree, I think, with almost everything you said. And my question, I think, is related to what Francesca also asked, is how, do you have any ideas on how we can even begin to get to a different priority and to make another concept, to put another concept in the place of GDP, because GDP and income are so salient. And so if you imagine an election campaign in Portugal, Germany, wherever, where a political party in a few years can campaign without promising to prioritize economic growth, and even with admitting openly that they are not going to strive after economic growth, and that they will be okay, and that they will pursue an agenda that will lead to zero economic growth, I think this will meet so much resistance. And even though I think you have all the good arguments on your side that this is the wrong way to think about development, I think it's so deeply entrenched into our culture and psyche that I'm just wondering, so what are your ideas to move there and to change the debate, the discourse in this way? Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. So let me just start with the first question about optimism. Yes, I'm using happiness broadly as subjective well-being. Optimism. We need to do. I'm not so into the literature on optimism. I mean, I don't know as much. So, but we would have to do the same exercise. We would have to see whether optimism is affected by the environment, or optimistic people tend to be more pro-environment, and so forth, so on and so forth. We have to see if having more more income, with more wealth, would produce more optimism, or the other way around. So I prefer to use happiness, because for me, happiness and subjective well-being is a more definite conception of well-being, of even in policy terms. Talking about changing the index, of course, when I do this, I support the idea of not using the GDP and start using other indicators. And the problem that we now have is that we have so many different indicators that go beyond GDP, and we have to choose one. We have to kind of gain the strengths that GDP once gained, and that monopoly position. And we need to coordinate researchers, politicians, public opinion, trying to accept other things as crucial. And when Johannes asked where to start again, I think that it's interesting, because in some companies in the private sector, they are moving to the ESG goals, so the environment, social, and governance, and they are moving greener, despite greenwashing, but they are moving sometimes greener, and they are facing this notion that only profit is not correct. We can discuss if they are doing this wholeheartedly, or are just being cynical, but maybe we could get some good surprises from them. Maybe, and if we can change micro structures, maybe you have a better chance to start changing microstructure. Because if I work for a company that is already engaged in this kind of reasoning, and where profits are not the sole end of the activity, and I enjoy and I understand that it's good to be there, it's good to be a part of such an environment, then I would understand that, okay, then the government should do the same. So I think the realities are mixed, are interlinked. And so, of course, it's a chicken and egg problem that Francesco told, but I believe that betting on micro initiatives can eventually trigger something. It's hard, I admit.
Thank you, Gabriel, for your replies. We are officially hitting the 60-minute tick, so the time for the seminar is over, and I do not want to keep people in the room any more than they wish. So if anyone wants to leave, please feel free to do so. If you have questions, however, and if Gabriel has still perhaps a couple of minutes, feel free to raise your virtual hand. Now I am monitoring the list, so I can see all the hands that raise or not. In the meantime, I was also thinking about the comment by Tiffany, and I hope that we can discuss this further in person when we will meet in June at the Measuring Progress annual meeting that will take place in Luxembourg 2nd and 3rd of June. And Tiffany will hopefully be with us. So to make it short, I'm even wondering, perhaps optimism is not really a measure of subjective well-being. It is linked to the concept, but optimism is a kind of expectation about a desired or desirable future about which we are uncertain. So it is related, but the definition of subjective well-being, as far as I'm concerned, is a self-reported assessment of how I'm doing with my current well-being now. And then we can measure it with various tools, but I wouldn't rank optimism as a direct measure of subjective well-being. Any agreement, disagreement?
I kind of agree with you, I think.
Hey, I think I disagree, only because
Welcome, Tiffany.
I think that the way that you think about how you're going to do in the future is rooted in how you're doing now. So I mean, I think it's not like a super strong disagree, but like a slight disagree. Like, I think that it still belongs in the suite of metrics that are used to sort of understand how folks are doing now. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yes. Okay, well, I don't see any additional questions. I want to thank you, Gabriel, for your very interesting work and for your generous presentation. I also want to thank all the participants for being with us and for the comments. I hope that you can join us in Luxembourg in June for our annual meeting, if not in presence, at least online. All the presentation will be shared online live. And well, thank you so much, and it was great to see you. I look forward to meet Gabriel in person whenever is possible.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.